This is the seventh in a series of resources that consider supply and demand. Part 1 looks at the law of demand, defining the law and providing the context from which we derive the law. Part 2 of the series considers the law of supply, providing the same analysis as in Part 1. Part 3 combines the laws of supply and demand to find the point of equilibrium and considers what happens if either quantity supplied or demanded change. Part 4 of the series looks at price floors and ceilings, which are government-imposed constraints placed on the prices at which goods may be sold. Part 5 inspects those factors in the marketplace which may change the overall demand for a particular good. Part 6 considers what can change the overall supply of a good. The final resource in the series inspects the interplay of changes in demand and supply and determines what would be the overall effect on the equilibrium price and quantity supplied. In the two previous resources, we saw what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity if either supply or demand changed. If demand increases, then both equilibrium price and quantity increase. If demand decreases, both price and quantity drop. If supply increases, the equilibrium price increases, but equilibrium price decreases. If supply decreases, then the equilibrium price increases, while the equilibrium quantity decreases. But what happens if both curves move? Suppose some combination of factors occurs that cause both the supply and demand to increase. This moves both curves to the right. After an adjustment period, a new equilibrium is reached. What happens to the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity? It is clear that the equilibrium quantity definitely increases. However, the change in equilibrium price depends on the relative size of the shift in supply and demand. If the demand curve moved more than the supply curve, then the equilibrium price will increase. If demand moved less, the equilibrium price drops. Or, if supply and demand moved the same amount, the equilibrium price is unaffected. But what happens if both supply and demand decrease? Both curves move to the left. A new equilibrium is reached. The equilibrium quantity decreases. As for the equilibrium price, it depends. If demand moves more, the price drops. If demand moves less than the supply, then price increases. But what happens if the curves move in opposite directions? Suppose it is expected that the future price for some product will increase. In the current time, that causes demand to increase, as consumers want to buy the good while the price is still low. Conversely, supply will decrease, as the producers will lower the supply until they can charge the higher price for their good. As such, the demand curve moves right and the supply curve moves left. After time, a new equilibrium is reached. But what happens to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity? The equilibrium price increases. However, what happens to the equilibrium quantity depends on the relative size of the shifts of the supply and demand curves. If demand moves more, then the equilibrium quantity increases. If demand moves less, then the equilibrium quantity decreases. If the two curves move the same amount, the equilibrium quantity will stay exactly the same. But what if demand decreases while supply increases? This moves the demand curve left and the supply curve right. A new equilibrium is reached, and the equilibrium price decreases. The equilibrium quantity depends on whether demand moves more or less than supply. If demand moves more, the equilibrium quantity decreases. If demand moves less, then the equilibrium quantity increases. Or if both supply and demand move the same amount, the equilibrium quantity stays fixed. What happens to equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity if both supply and demand are changed? In all possible shifts, either equilibrium price or equilibrium quantity are guaranteed to change. The change in the other factor depends on the relative size of the shifts for the supply and demand curves. If both supply and demand increase, then the equilibrium quantity will increase. If supply and demand both decrease, then equilibrium quantity will decrease. Equilibrium price increases when demand increases and supply decreases. Finally, equilibrium price decreases when demand moves left and supply moves right.